This is NEGOTIATEx TV.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on the NEGOTIATEx podcast. We are continuing our conversation with Dr. Belinda Chiu, author, speaker, and executive coach. If you haven't already checked out part A of the show, be sure to do that first. Let's jump into the conversation with Belinda. So when it comes to compassionate candor, I feel like this is one that so many of us just don't get it correct. And so we either feel like we need to sugarcoat everything or that we need to be jerks and bullies. Where do you see compassionate candor lacking today? And what can we do to overcome this feeling that it's in either or choice of being insincerely nice or blunt directness?
I appreciate sort of this is one of the toughest pieces that I know I don't always get either. And that's why it's always considered, it's a journey for us. And I do think we tend to, as human beings, most of us don't like conflict. Even those of us say I like conflict, most of us don't. From a neurobiological perspective, when we're in conflict, right? So my dog we wind up right? Our brains kind of go into very quickly like I'm in danger, and when I'm in danger, I'm going to either come right back at you, or I'm just going to shut down and stop in the conversation. And so there are spaces where we tend to either say, well, take it and leave it. That's it. Like you said, being a bully or a bluntness. And again, keep in mind that most people aren't intending. I would like to argue that most people have good intentions. They really genuinely do. I mean, the impact is always that smooth, right? So we tend to sort of veer on that side, or as you said, sort of the avoidant, avoidant kindness, right? There's insincere niceness and there's avoidant kindness, which is, where everything's nice and everything's great, but we sort of sweep everything under the rug. It's what, Ricky Boyatis calls the stinky fish. He has this great book called Hostage at the Table. Have you heard of so it talks about the stinky fish under the table, and he's like, so oftentimes in cheap, like everyone smells the fish. Kind of pretend it's not there. And what is it like if we just bring the fish up on the table and it's going to be messy, we're going to get our hands dirty, there's going to be, some disagreement, but at the end we can clean the fish and have a nice meal with you fish, right? So, all of those pieces of how do you bring that element of, it's really, is this a lost opportunity if I don't bring this up? Is this a lost opportunity if I don't bring this up? Is this a lost opportunity for me to learn something? Is this a lost opportunity for me to learn something? And it's not about blaming or naming or shaming. And I think that's a really important piece, because it's also, and this is where compassion comes in, is how do I separate intention from impact? Because intention is not the same as impact. Now, does that mean I ignore the impact? No. Doesn't mean I ignore the impact, but I also come with greater perhaps equanimity. And I haven't been able to answer the question of how do you show humanity for those, how do you show compassion for those who don't see your humanity? I'll be honest, I'm still working through that. I'm right. It's a big question. But it is one of those I always think about, I was just telling someone today, the three questions I often ask myself is, because I've got myself in many trouble before by not asking these questions, which is, does something need to be said? Does something need to be said right now? Does something need to be said right now by me? The answer is all three. I'll probably say something, but it gives me space and that power. And that's where centeredness again comes in, is if I'm giving myself that pause instead of just reacting, my response hopefully will serve a greater intention than me just being right. I actually Tuck at Marshall Goldsmith, who taught at Tuck at his last, I was there for his last live lecture. And so he said, Belinda, stop trying to win. And I was like, go, I'm not winning. So the thing that I think is it's hard, right? I'm just like, wow, he's right, not right. And he's like, stop trying to win. It's not a competition. It's not a game, right? And I take what he said to heart, because it's shifting from that needing to be right to saying, what's my greatest intention? For me, for you, for us. What's my greatest intention for me, for you, than us? Because then, so what my martial arts teacher says, he's like, it's like wielding an iron sword wrapped in velvet. And I use this analogy a lot, and I love it. And I'm like, oh, I do that. So it's not again about rolling over and being like, oh, you can, I'm not ignoring the impact, but I'm doing it in a way that, because I know I mess up. And when I mess up, I would love for you to correct me, but in a kinder, gentler way. Like, don't just whack me inside with this iron sword. Put it before you do that.
It's this shift. What I hear as you're talking about it, so much goes back to initial points that you were making around, awareness and awareness plus mindfulness plus. It's also this shift in thinking that conflict is always a negative thing, that actually conflict can be a healthy thing. And I think that's probably difficult for a lot of people to grasp and even embrace.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it triggers so much, right, it's how we grow up. It's how, right, when we observe different models of how people handle conflict, right, that has a lot of it. How we are recipients of when things haven't gone well, right? There's certain moments that I can say, there's certain moments of conflict where I'm more comfortable speaking up, and others where I'm like, and I can tell in my body when that happens. And it's because it's nothing to do actually with the situation, but it reminds me of things that just were so uncomfortable. And so that's why this practice of not just, again, self-awareness plus and so ways, but it's putting it into action. So this is, there's a saying 100% like, the retreat in the woods is one thing, but the real retreat space is in the city, in the middle of a city, in the middle of a boardroom. That's where the work is, right? Because that's where it's more complicated. And so even recognizing where, and the practice of sort of centeredness, compassion is part of it, is the embodiment of leadership, because and oftentimes leaders, it's brilliant, right? Leaders are, because they're good at what they do, but then that means we also overanalyze things, we ruminate things. We can analyze, we can justify anything with our words and our rationale, or quote, rationality, which isn't always rational. But the more we're able to tap into sort of the different data points, and all of this is data points, and we have to be careful because the body is that really important book. The Body Keeps Score. It's not an easy book to read, but the body also puts a lot of trauma. But the more we're aware of how even physiologically I'm responding to something, the quicker I am, or the more intentional and choiceful I can be about how I respond. Right. So just, when I'm thinking confident, I'm like, I know, for me, it's like, look, it starts here. And the minute I notice that, I've got to be like blending out a ring, because the next thing you do might not be really useful in this next phase. And I know where it shows up for me.
Well, I know that curiosity is the final C of your compassion strategy. So I know that this is something Aaron and I definitely love, and that we're convinced that most of us just aren't as curious as we need to be, especially when we're addressing today's issues, whether they're social, political, economic, business, etc. So kind of two questions here. How do you think about creativity and helping someone become more creative? And then number two, how do activities such as improv help create a more creative mindset?
Great questions. And as you can see, sort of how they all connect, right? This builds back into curiosity, really comes back into what we talked about, that intentionality, that purposeful play, the ability to embrace conflict. Because if you think about even conflict, and to your point earlier about, when you think about children, when they have a conflict, of course, sometimes it can be very, but you look at this innocent children's play, right? There's conflict and they figure it out, right? For them, it's like, okay, now we figured out who's whatever, and I want to play the blah, 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 blah. But they figure it out because they're not seeing conflict as a bad thing. It's just their way of working things out. And so the more leaders can embrace conflict and actually set up systems for that kind of healthy discussion. I worked with this one group, and then I'll answer your question. So I'm kind of going sideways a little bit. Yeah. I worked with this one agency called Work in Progress. They're awesome. And one of the reasons why I that was really insightful, because a lot of times, especially in they're the big ad agencies that did like Domino's, like some pretty incredible campaigns. And oftentimes after a project, there's postmortems, right? They don't call it postmortems, they call it retrospections. And I love that. It sounds so simple, right? But for them, postmortem is like after you die, and then we're going to talk about what went wrong, and that can draw up conflict. But for them, it's about having that space to simply kind of go, hey, what can we learn, right? And so, can that feel like it could be, conflict could come up, but it doesn't, it's looking at things that didn't work well or disagreements in a really helpful way, right? And that leads to the sense of curiosity, is how can I be open to what I don't know, right? And most of the time, right, there's that Dunning-Wood Loring effect. The more the more we know, the less confident we are, or the vice versa, the less we know, the more confident we are. And curiosity, I really don't know anything. Is what I knew that before or nothing. And I'm okay with that, right? Because it's the sense of, and it goes back to that child mind, is how do I stay curious? What don't I know? What don't I know? And part of that helps us to, and that's why connection is so important, because we talk about, especially DIA inclusion so much, right? But all of us, including me, I'm constantly being like, I haven't heard that term before. I need to learn this. Like, tell me more, right? So all of these things, it's how do we actually fully stay curious about the other? It's Mr. Rogers, I think, who and she actually gave the commencement speech. I saw his commencement speech at Dartmouth. But, I think it's Mr. Rogers who said, it's impossible to hate someone once you know their story. I love that. Right? Because it is kind of hard to, you might disagree with so many of what they do and but it's really hard to once you know their story. And so how do we stay curious to someone's story? Because their story is different than yours, right? And by allowing that, and as leaders, for us to stay curious, it's not only about the people who work with us, but staying curious about what we don't know. And I think really some of the strongest leaders, who's just she just popped up to mind. I won't sort of share exactly who it is, but she maintains this curiosity about everything. And that's why, she's been recognized by her company as one of the top, whatever, they have these awards. And it's because she's always got this, what don't I know? And so it allows her to always find the different spaces where she can really build and inform what she needs to do in her department. And that, in a way, is improv, right? It's taking what is clear and drawing from what don't I know. And I'm not ignoring, I say there's a pink elephant here. There's a pink elephant here right now in the room with us. That's the fourth, guest on this, a podcast. There's a fourth elephant. Now we have to work with the fourth elephant. And the elephant, now we four elephants too, apparently. And taking that piece and building on and creating something that hasn't been thought about before. And then, so curiosity and creativity, I think to your point, I think oftentimes we have this misunderstanding about what creativity means as well.
Say a little bit more about that. Could you please?
Yeah. I mean, how many of us go, I'm not creative?
I hear that from my students a lot, right? That I'm just not a creative person. So what you're asking me to do here is something I'm not wired to do.
I do, right? Yeah. Right. It's like, I'm an analytical person. I'm a da-da-da person. I'm not, because we oftentimes think of creativity as, which it is, but art, drawing, music, all of those things, which I am zero talented in music. And I'd play the air guitar. So it's funny. I worked with this, one organization called Creative Creatures, for example, and Han Christensen, who founded this, and they've been working on this for now probably 15, 20 years, and it's the psychometric assessment actually about creativity. And what I love about this model, this is one particular model, but I do find it quite useful, is to shift the mindset that creativity is about one type of creativity. And what I love is that her question is always, and when we use, and I just did a session on these creative styles, creative IDs a couple weeks ago. It's not about how creative are you, but it's how are you creative. And many of us have different styles of creativity. Some of us are really great at generating ideas, which tends to be the default way of looking at creativity, right? You're an idea generator or you're not creative at all. But some of the most creative people are the ones who I think about, folks who are able to take something and just make it amazing. That's not my skill set. I'm like, can you just put this, I came with the idea, can someone just make this? And then someone just put it, and it becomes this like Legos, right? It becomes this magical piece, whereas mine looks like, anything. But that's where I am. Very difficult word. So, I think for us to encourage leaders to also start exploring, one, how creative in what ways are they creative, and in what ways does creativity show up with their team members? Because it's going to be different and it doesn't look the same. And when we talk about inclusion, it's generally really thinking about how are the different people on my team creative in their own ways, and am I leveraging their creativity in the best way possible? Right? Like, you don't want me to be the one who's putting the finishing touches on anything, it's not going to be pretty. Like that really everybody's time, right? But at this, so are we matching and aligning people's whys, right? Their authenticity, their core values. Are we aligning with their whys? Are we really leveraging the strengths that they have and using those strengths to actually develop the areas where they could grow?
That's a wonderful piece in terms of leading teams. And it's a direction I wasn't sure we'd go in. I was going to ask a question, maybe I'll still go here, about how I manage creativity for myself. I like how you made that very inclusive of how I bring in the creativity of others. There's a quote that I was shown, some time ago from Dee Hock, who was founder and former CEO of Visa, that said the problem is never how to get new innovative thoughts into your mind, but how to get the old ones out. Every mind is a building with archaic furniture. Clean out a corner of your mind and creativity will instantly fill it. Curious how that does or doesn't resonate with you. And are there practices? Are there things that I could do or should be doing to kind of allow space for creativity? Great
quote. And great. I guess first I was to say, let's remove the should and could, right? So there's no should. What works. But it's interesting, that quote. It's one that I sort of agree with, where in the sense that I do think what resonates with me with that quote is the importance of unlearning, right? Part of learning is unlearning. And I'm sure you have as well, that oftentimes some of the leaders that I work with, which I would say maybe a little more challenging sometimes, is that when there's certain ways we've been doing things for a very long time, it's really hard to unlearn. I know I do, right? I've always done it this way, right? So we sort of have this, because it's comfortable, we know it. And obviously in many ways, it's probably works for us in many ways. Now, is that the best approach or the most effective approach moving forward in this ever-changing world? Maybe, maybe not. So unlearning can be challenging. I do find for example, one thing I love about sort of coaching tech students, for example, is they've got this, kind of very open, sort of that child's mind in some ways, and not that they're children, but that openness sometimes is a little bit more evident in emerging leaders for obvious reasons, right? Obvious reasons. It's not a judgment call. It's kind of obvious why. So I think that resonates with me in terms of sometimes it's unlearning things. The other part of that resonates with me is the need to kind of, and so what Michelle Mavars, who's a deal of Beyond EI, she says, I love this, she goes, empty your head trash. Right? Because we all have this head trash in our brains. And, I'm looking at now the little recycling bin on my computer right there, right? Throw everything away. But then I sometimes get that message of like, you're running out of memory. I'm like, but I threw everything away. But I also kept 50K like the trash that I haven't deleted. So I think it's out there, but it's still there. Right. Yeah. So sometimes and that's where, again, centeredness comes in. That authentic sort of authenticity comes in to say, what is still there in the recesses of my mind that is no longer of service? Is this a dialogue or conversation or recurring loop that keeps playing over? Yeah. And maybe I thought I put it aside, 10 years later, poof, there it comes again, right? Is that no longer serving? That said, I do think it's also important not to just completely necessarily wipe everything out just because it was an idea that was done before. Because sometimes, it's Professor Perry at Tech, he says, well, it's, again, I'm really good at misquoting everybody, but he says something about how the best organizations, they never experiment at their core. So back to sort of if you know your core, what he says is that, excellent organizations always experiment at the edges, because if you know who you are, now you can experiment at the edges. And so there is something to be said that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If that's a useful thing. Does that make sense? So
yeah, thanks. No, I think that was a wonderful response. And you mentioned in there, these different audiences you work with. You work with a wide range from C-suite to undergrads. And I know you've done some work with veterans as students at Dartmouth too. So as two veterans, we say thank you for the work you're doing there too. As you try to practice these things with students, what do you see as differences in their response and receptiveness, potentially generational, potentially of experience, right? This is how we've always done it. I'm just curious, better response from some, more difficult, more resistance from others?
I would say more or less, I would just say different in some ways, different in some ways because of just experience, right? Experience and all of that, right? So whether it's, working with our veteran students or someone who's been, I've worked with a few retirees, which, I haven't had that experience. Of retire, right? Never, but I think sort of that human element is pretty consistent, right? And I think most people who at least find the calling, I don't know if calling is the right word, but to say coaching or leadership, there's something that calls to them about there's got to be a different, or not a different way, but there's got to be another way to show up where I can be more of who I am or be more effective at, right? So there's this sort of genuine desire usually from whoever it is. I would say from sort of young emerging leaders, for example, and I think this is something that I have noticed in the last 15 years or so, there's been sort of a shift of more urgency in how to lead with greater equanimity, compassion, empathy. The words empathy, emotional intelligence never came up before, right? It was like, how do I be a more effective, productive leader? And it's not that those words weren't, it wasn't that the leaders didn't care about that. It's we're now more, we're more familiar with the words, but also I think, especially since the world has been the way it has been, there's just a greater urgency that I think most of us, again, want to be in a society where justice and equity and love and all of those things are, sort of, really, dominate the conversation rather than sometimes what is on the news. That's not to ignore what's there, but I think there's a greater sense that this is not about us anymore, right? And I think a lot of the leaders that I had the fortune of working with also see that, right? So, a lot of the leaders that I see, whether they've been, in this world of, building giant buildings all across, countries for decades, are really being more open to like, okay, well, how does this multi-million-dollar building that I'm building impact the short term, right? In terms of the communities that it impacts, how does are the very materials I'm using going to have, what kind of effect does that have on our carbon footprint? Like all of those things it's just like, I do find it, and that's where the hope is that I think more and more leaders and emerging leaders are recognizing that they are in a position of power to influence where we go.
You mentioned earlier, Belinda, that the things we've been discussing today are often called soft skills. Anyone who have ever tried to practice this knows that it's really difficult, and it's not uncommon to get them wrong when dealing with the real people in the real world. How do you encourage a leader who is trying to put these concepts into practice, but maybe struggling with it or thinks that they may be failing with it?
I think it's a great question. One is, let's reframe the word soft skill. Again, that's maybe just my connection, but reframing that. But I guess your question makes me think of two things. One is building the business case, right? I think for a while, leaders who have done this and believe in this, and so we have some leaders who have been pioneers in doing this work. They've had a long struggle because sometimes they were the only voice, right, to say this is important. The good news, hopefully, is that there's more and more evidence around why there's a business case for this type of work and approach to things. Because to be quite honest, my point of view is we don't have any other choice. Like we can decide as humans right now to go one way or the other way. I kind of want to go one way, the way in which we all sort of guide. That's what I would like to see, even if I'm not going to be here to see it. That's okay, right? That's again, that's part of the human condition. So I think one is seek out support from others. There's other leaders out there who are providing and offering, doing the work, putting into practice, right? So if you look at, for example, Search Inside Yourself has for a long time worked with SAP, and they were one of the pioneers to bring mindfulness and emotional intelligence. SAP, right? You kind of think, boy, if they're, they said this is important, and we've seen the impact of it. There's a group, Mindful on Wall Street, right? You think investment bankers and mindfulness? What? There's a group of leading, high impact individuals who understand that what does it actually mean to be, to do this with compassion, so that it's not, yes, do they help their clients make money? Oh yeah, right. And it's with sort of that minute. So there's, I think one side of it is that it being okay and asking for the, a business case, if that helps to bring this type of work into their work. But also think about that can help inform who's at the table, who's not at the table. How do we, and it's because it's not, I think one thing to consider is this work isn't something we add on, right? Because a lot of times that whole mindfulness movement, right, that we call mindfulness, it's like, oh, I have a yoga class. And I love yoga, by the way, so I'm not dogging yoga, big fan of yoga. But instead of just sort of saying, oh, it's an add-on, it's just this, it's very similar to equity, diversity and equity. It's not an add-on. It's about who we are, right, and how we do things. So how do we actually bring this? And that's why I call it a strategy, because the strategy is how we do things so that we're actually impacting the entire ecosystem. That said, the other piece that you mentioned is that self part, that own work, right? For leaders, we kind of have to, right? It's being the role model, walking the walk. We kind of have to role model this. And yeah, there's times where, do I always have a consistency? Right? Are there times I fall off the handle? Oh yeah, right? So it's again, sort of that notion of sort of self-compassion is, how do I acknowledge when I've messed up, and not that using it as an excuse, but as sort of that opportunity. Okay, we learn. I remember when I started, so I've been yoga since I was a little kid, because my dad always said done yoga, but he never told me it was yoga. I just copied him. But when I started meditating, I remember and learning, I was like, I can do this, because right? I'm like, I'm going to do 20 minutes. And I slept for 19 of those 20 minutes. So it's like, this is great rest. But it was, right? So I'm like, okay, baby steps. So some of that is just a little bit of humility, be like, let me start at 1 minute and go the other way around. So I had to learn. It was a great nap, but it wasn't doing much for me.
Yeah, been there. This has been a fascinating, wonderful conversation. I knew it would be. Thank you so much for that. As we get ready to wrap up, I've got a 2-part question for you. First of all, what's next for you? What's your next challenge that you're aiming towards? And what challenge would you lay out there for our listeners from the things we've talked about today, or anything we didn't get to?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's 2 great questions. Man, this is going to be like a good for me. So as I mentioned, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. But I think the next challenge for me, I've been, so over the pandemic, I, like everybody else, kind of like, what else am I curious about? And I've always been curious about, I've always loved the outdoors. I've always just, that's just been my space. And I've always been fascinated by, I don't know if you've familiar with sort of forest bathing in Japan. There's a lot of science around being in the forest. Again, the evidence is piling up more and more, but there's a lot of research around not just about stress reduction, but actually about how to being more innovative, more creative, memory retention, all of that sort of being outside in nature. And so I actually got certified to do forest therapy over the pandemic. And my challenge right now is to how do I integrate more of, because right now it makes sense in my head. Now I gotta figure out how to articulate that out into the world. But it's understanding how do we weave in this important piece of and it's not a new concept. I mean, there's been worldviews, and many different communities have for a very long time. That's the worldview by which things are done, is in sync with what David Abram calls a more than human world. And so part of my challenge is how do I get leaders in sort of this other constructed world in this quote modern age that we've created to embrace and re-establish these reciprocal relationships with the more than human world. And so there's a piece of stuff I've been working on and understanding how do we learn from mycelium network and mushrooms into organization design structures. Like, it's kind of nerdy and it makes sense. It makes total, but I've got to figure out how to articulate it. But that's how generally I work. It's like, it's not, I sent a couple copies to friends and they're like, what are you talking about? You got to I'm working on it. And so that part, I try to figure out how to weave that piece into, and it connects into this purposeful play and improv and this importance of global awareness of this and this last project that I was just on just reignited that joy I have of, when you bring people together and share space. I mean, that's, talk about being a force for good. I'm like and I didn't do it. I was just sort of being able to observe all these amazing individuals to help them, as the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Chichen had said, right? Being a force for good. So that's my challenge. How that show, I don't know. That's going to be for the next, maybe off the record podcast, or you can help me with it. But it's that staying curious about where that takes this work. And I guess that maybe leads to the next challenge for our listeners is, how do you bring elements of this compassion strategy not just into your work, but into your everyday, right? And I'm sure many of us who are listening to this, if you are either one, I've bored you to death, or two, you already know this and you're doing it, but how can you sort of challenge yourself to really think about your individual practice and how that ripple affects to everyone around you? And what do you need from others? What do you need from me? What do you need from your colleagues? Like, how do we create this so that it's a momentous shift rather than certain disparate? That's why, like, for example, Mindful Wall Street, I find so intriguing. It's not just a couple individuals and different banks that are doing it. They figured out a way of, let's release ego. It's not about my bank is doing this better than yours. It's we're all in this together because we're in the same ocean. We're not all on the same boat. Some of us are still floating on that door that Rose wouldn't let Jack off of, but we need to be mindful of all those different, spaces where people are showing up, and to make sure that we do have a way to navigate these waters we're in.
Beautifully said. And I love that as a call to action. So I'm going to pass it over to Nolan, because I think that was a great note to end on.
Thank you all for listening to the NEGOTIATEx podcast. If you could please rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next episode. Hey, thanks for checking out this video on NEGOTIATEx TV. If you found any value at all, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification icon if you want to be notified of future videos. And then we also have a couple videos over here that you might be interested in checking out. If you and your small business, your team are looking to get negotiations or leadership training, then you can head over to NEGOTIATEx.com and learn more about the coaching services we offer. Thanks, and I'll see you over in the next video.